My name is Raymond Colby. I'm 62 years old, and I want you to take a slow breath before you keep listening, because what I'm about to share with you is the hardest thing I have ever had to put into words. This happened inside my own home, to my own flesh and blood, while I was doing everything I thought a man was supposed to do, working hard, paying bills, trying to keep a roof solid over the people I loved. I never imagined that the danger my son needed protecting from was not outside those walls. It was sleeping in the bed right next to me. I have been sitting on this story for almost 2 years now. My pastor told me to write it down. My therapist told me to speak it out loud. And my son, my Noah, told me that if telling it helped even one child somewhere, then we should tell it. So here I am. And I want you to know, before anything else, that my boy is okay now. He is more than okay. But we had to walk through fire to get there. And I want you to understand every step of that walk. I married my wife Sandra when I was 54 years old. I know what you're thinking. 54. A lot of people raised their eyebrows. She was 41, which was not a scandalous gap by any stretch. But I had already been through one marriage that ended quietly after 22 years. No fireworks, no betrayal, just two people who had grown into strangers who happened to share a last name. My first wife and I never had children together. That was a wound I carried for a long time. So when Sandra came into my life, bright and certain and full of plans, and she told me she wanted a family, I felt something unlock in my chest that I thought had rusted shut for good. Noah was born when I was 55. I remember sitting in the hospital room that night, holding him under the fluorescent lights, and thinking that I had gotten the timing completely wrong on this life, that I had wasted 30 years not knowing this feeling. He had this little wrinkled forehead that looked exactly like my father's, and he grabbed my finger without even opening his eyes, and I made him a promise right there that I intended to keep until the day I died. For the first 7 or so years, things were fine. Not perfect, nothing is, but fine. I was working as an independent business consultant, which sounds more glamorous than it is. Mostly I drove to client offices within a 2 or 3 hour radius, helped small companies reorganize their operations, and came home for dinner. Occasionally I had to travel overnight, maybe once every 6 or 8 weeks, but it was never more than 2 nights at a stretch. Sandra worked part-time at a dental office 3 days a week. Noah went to school, made friends, played in the backyard, drove me crazy with his obsession with building things out of whatever he could find in the garage. A normal boy, a happy boy. The change started so gradually that I almost missed it entirely. It was September, I think, when he was 8, nearly 9. I noticed he was not finishing his dinner. Not occasionally, the way kids do when something exciting is on their mind, but consistently, night after night, pushing food around the plate with a kind of mechanical effort that looked more like performance than appetite. I asked him about it, and he said his stomach hurt. I figured a bug. I gave it a week. Then I noticed the eyes. Noah had always had bright eyes. Wide, curious, the kind that found everything interesting. When he started coming to breakfast, looking like he had not slept in days, I asked him if he was staying up late. He said no. I checked his tablet, nothing unusual. No games running past bedtime. I told myself maybe he was going through a growth phase. I told myself kids go through things, but there was something else. A small thing that I almost cannot explain. When I would walk into a room where Noah and Sandra were together, and Sandra had not heard me coming, there was a half second where I would catch his face before he had time to arrange it. And in that half second, I saw something I did not recognize. It was not sadness exactly. It was more like vigilance, like a small animal that has learned to track sounds. I told myself I was imagining it. I want to say this clearly to anyone listening who is a parent. Trust that feeling. Whatever it is that lives in your gut when something is wrong with your child, trust it. Do not explain it away. Do not let a reasonable voice in your head talk you out of it. I lost weeks to reasonable explanations, and I will never fully forgive myself for that. The morning that changed everything was a Tuesday in late October. I was getting ready for a one-night consulting trip about 90 miles north of us. Not a big deal. I had done it dozens of times. I had packed a bag the night before. Sandra had made coffee. Everything looked ordinary. I went to say goodbye to Noah before school and found him sitting on the edge of his bed, already dressed, staring at the floor. He looked up at me when I came in, and I saw something on his forearm, a bruise. Yellowish-green the way bruises get when they are a few days old, shaped wrong, not the round bruise of a fall, not the long bruise of bumping a corner. It was the shape of fingers, 4 distinct marks on the inside of his forearm. I sat down next to him, and I kept my voice as steady as I have ever kept anything in my life. I asked him where that came from. He said he fell at recess. I said, "Buddy, that doesn't look like a fall." He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something pass across his face that I cannot describe adequately. It was like watching a door close from the inside. He pulled his sleeve down and said he was fine and that I was going to be late. I did not leave for my trip that morning. I went back downstairs and told Sandra that the client had rescheduled, which was a lie, and that I would be home for dinner. She seemed annoyed she had plans with her sister Carol that afternoon, she said, and I apologized and told her to go ahead and keep them, that I could pick Noah up from school myself. She agreed readily enough, which at the time I read as normal, but which I would later understand differently. I called my client from the car and rescheduled for the following week. Then I drove to the hardware store. I want to be honest about what I was thinking at this point, because I know some people will judge the decision I made. I was not thinking clearly in the sense of having a plan. I was operating on pure instinct, the kind of instinct that bypasses the thinking brain entirely. I knew I needed to see something I was not being shown. I knew there was a version of what was happening in my own house that I did not have access to. And I knew that whatever that version was, it involved my son's arm looking the way it looked that morning. I bought a small camera, the kind that looks like a phone charger block. I had read enough online, in those desperate middle-of-the-night searches that parents of worried children know all too well, to know how to set it up. I installed it that afternoon while Sandra was out, and Noah was still at school, positioned at an angle that covered his bed and his door. I picked Noah up from school and made his favorite dinner and helped him with his homework and put him to bed myself. Sandra came home from her sister's around 8. She seemed lighter, I remember, more relaxed than she had been in weeks. We watched television. We went to bed. I did not sleep. I waited until I heard Sandra's breathing slow beside me, and then I lay there in the dark for another hour. And then I got up quietly and took my phone into the bathroom and opened the app connected to the camera. I want to stop here for just a moment, because I have to be honest about what it costs a person to press play on something like that. There is a part of you that is still hoping you are wrong. There is a part of you that genuinely wants to feel foolish, wants the footage to show nothing, wants to be the paranoid old man who overreacted. I would have given anything in that moment to feel foolish. I pressed play. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. The room was dark, but the camera had night vision and the image was clear enough. I watched my son sleeping. For a few minutes, nothing happened. And then the door opened. Sandra came into the room without turning on any light. She moved with the particular quietness of someone who has done a thing many times before. And that quietness, the practiced efficiency of it, was what hit me first, before anything else, before I even fully processed what I was seeing. She had done this before, many times. There was no hesitation in any of her movements. She stood over Noah's bed. She said something I could barely make out. I would have to turn up the volume later to catch it, and even then, the words are not something I am going to repeat here, because they are not something my son should ever have heard from the person who was supposed to love him most. What I will tell you is that they were cruel in the specific way that only someone who knows a child deeply can be cruel, targeted at the exact things a 9-year-old boy is most uncertain about in himself. And then she grabbed his arm, the same arm I had seen that morning, and she squeezed. Noah woke with a small cry that he immediately muffled with his pillow. He had learned to muffle it. I put my hand over my mouth in that bathroom, and I stood there for 30 seconds telling myself to stay still. Stay still. Go in there, and you make it worse right now. Stay still and be smart. Because I knew I had read enough. I had thought enough in those insomniac hours that if I burst in there, angry and unprepared, Sandra would deny everything. The footage might not be enough without context, and Noah would be left in a situation that could get more dangerous, not less. I stayed still, and I am not going to pretend that decision did not cost me something I will never entirely recover. But I was smart about what I did next. I went back to the bedroom. I lay down, and as soon as the light outside began to gray, I got up and showered and dressed and told Sandra, calmly, that I had to go into the office unexpectedly for something urgent. She did not question it. I kissed Noah on the head while he was still half asleep, and I told him I loved him, and I told him I would be back soon, and I told him I said this clearly. Looking at him, I told him that everything was going to be different very soon. He looked up at me with those tired eyes, and I saw something flicker in them that I hope was understanding. I drove 4 miles to a diner, and I sat in a corner booth, and I called my friend Frank, who I have known since we were both 23 years old, and who is one of the most level-headed human beings I have ever met. I told him what I had seen. I did not editorialize. I described it the way I would describe a scene to a client, clearly, sequentially, without gaps. That Frank was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "Ray, call a lawyer first, right now before anything else. Call a family attorney and tell them you have footage. Ask them what the right order of operations is. Do not go to the police without knowing what you are doing." It was exactly the right advice. I found a family law attorney who had an opening that morning. I explained it was urgent, and she agreed to see me at 10 o'clock. I sat across from her, and I showed her the footage on my phone, and I watched her expression change as she watched it. She was a professional, and she kept her face mostly neutral, but I saw her jaw tighten. She told me several things clearly. First, the footage was admissible given the circumstances and jurisdiction. Second, I needed to contact Child Protective Services directly, in addition to the police, not instead of. Third, I should not return home and confront Sandra alone, because emotional confrontations at this stage almost always complicated custody proceedings. Fourth, and most critically, she advised me to go to Noah's school that same morning and have him evaluated by the school counselor, which would create an official record. I did exactly that, in that order. I called Child Protective Services while still sitting in the lawyer's office. I drove to the school. I sat with the counselor, a calm, careful woman who knew exactly what she was doing, and she spent an hour with Noah while I sat outside in the hallway, feeling like every minute lasted 10 years. When she came out, she sat down next to me, and she said, "Mr. Colby, your son has been wanting to tell someone for a long time." I put my face in my hands. I am not embarrassed about that. What came out in Noah's conversation with the counselor, and later with the investigator from Child Protective Services, was more systematic than even the footage had suggested. Sandra had been doing this for almost 8 months, always at night, always in a way that left marks in places clothing would cover, always accompanied by words designed to make Noah believe he was the problem, that he was bad, that he was difficult, that he made things hard for everyone. A 9-year-old boy had been carrying that alone for 8 months because he had been told explicitly that no one would believe him if he spoke. There was something else. Sandra's sister Carol knew. This came out over the following days as investigators built their picture. Carol had visited the house 3 months earlier and had found Noah in the kitchen with a bruise above his collar line. According to Noah, Carol had looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at Sandra, and then said, and I am paraphrasing, because the exact words are part of a legal record, something to the effect that he needed to learn to be tougher, and that boys who cried about nothing made things worse for themselves. Carol had not just looked away, she had reinforced it. She had told a frightened 8-year-old child that his pain was his own fault. When I found this out, I will tell you honestly that the anger I felt about Carol was in some ways sharper than what I felt about Sandra, because Carol was supposed to be neutral. Carol was supposed to be a person outside of whatever was happening inside my marriage. She had chosen instead to become a wall between my son and any help that might have reached him sooner. The investigators did not overlook this. I want to be very clear about that, because I know from everything I have read and heard since then that people are rightly outraged when witnesses and enablers walk away without consequences. Carol was contacted by investigators. She was interviewed. The details of what she said to Noah were documented. She did not face criminal charges in the end, and I will not pretend I made peace with that immediately. but she was formally cited by Child Protective Services as a person who had observed abuse and failed to report it, which in our state carried its own legal weight, and which her employer, who worked in a school district, was legally notified of. She was placed on a mandatory reporter failure record. She lost her position. I did not celebrate that. Exactly. But I will not lie and tell you I was sorry. Sandra was arrested 3 days after I went to that lawyer's office. I was the one who called the police. I did it standing in the driveway of our house on a cold November morning, and I did it with my lawyer on one line and Frank in the car behind me in case I needed him. 2 officers went inside. Sandra did not go quietly, and that is all I will say about that, because Noah does not need to read one day about the details of the worst morning of his young life, and I am not going to give more air to a scene that is already burned into enough memories. What followed was the thing they do not show you in movies, the long, grinding, humiliating, emotionally devastating work of family court. The hearings, the evaluators, the depositions, the hours in waiting rooms, the late-night calls with the attorney, the forms, the records requests, the character witnesses, the supervised visitation disputes, the motions and counter-motions that turned the worst thing that had ever happened to my son into a bureaucratic exercise that moved at the speed of a glacier. I want to be honest about the cost of this, because I think people hear he got custody and they imagine something clean and conclusive, and it is not. It is not clean. There are days in the middle of it when you feel like the system was designed specifically to exhaust you into giving up. There are moments when your lawyer gives you realistic updates that feel like being told your house is on fire and we think we can maybe save one room. There are nights when your son wakes up from a nightmare and comes and finds you in the living room because he cannot sleep, and you sit together on the couch under one blanket watching nothing on television, and you understand that healing is not an event, it is a direction. I want to talk about Noah for a moment, because he is the whole point of every word I have said so far. In the months after Sandra was removed from our home, my son went through something that his child psychologist described to me as a process of thawing. She used that word specifically, and it has stayed with me. She said that children who experience prolonged abuse in their most intimate space, their home, their family, build a kind of internal frost as a survival mechanism. They learn to feel less, express less, need less visibly, because need had become dangerous. And that thawing process, she said, looks different than healing. It looks messier. It looks like anger that comes from nowhere, or tears for small things that seem out of proportion, or laughter that arrives suddenly and then disappears just as fast. Noah thawed, slowly, then all at once, the way things do. The first time he came home from school talking without stopping, just talking about nothing, about a kid who had done something funny at lunch, about a bird he had seen on the way home, about whether I thought aliens would like pizza. I sat at the kitchen table listening to him, and I thought, there you are. There's the boy who has been in there the whole time, just waiting for it to be safe to come out. He's 10 now. He still sees his psychologist twice a month, which we will keep doing for as long as he needs, and not 1 week less. He is doing well in school. He has friends. He is building something in the garage right now, some contraption involving a pulley system and a basket and what appears to be ambitious engineering that I have learned not to question. He comes and finds me when he needs something, and he lets me come and find him. And that trust between us, that ease, is something I do not take for granted for a single day. I am asked sometimes, by people who know the full story, whether I blame myself. It is a complicated question, and I want to answer it honestly rather than in the way that sounds best. Yes, I carry weight about the months. I told myself reasonable explanations. I carry weight about the morning I saw that bruise, and did not act in the first 60 seconds in the way my gut told me to act. I have learned, in therapy, to distinguish between responsibility and guilt, that I can acknowledge what I missed, without deciding that missing it makes me the villain of my own son's story. That distinction has taken real work to hold on to. What I do not blame myself for is what I did once I knew. I acted that day, not in 2 days, not after sleeping on it, Not after giving anyone the benefit of the doubt that the footage had already stripped away. That is the thing I would say to any parent who finds themselves where I was sitting in that diner booth. If you know, you move. Not tomorrow. Now. Your child cannot afford the time it takes you to be polite about the truth. There is something else I want to address, because I have had conversations since this happened that went in a direction I did not expect. People sometimes want to analyze Sandra, to explain her, to understand the psychology, to map her cruelty onto some framework that makes it make sense. I have spent time with that impulse myself, and I understand it. We want things to make sense because senselessness is terrifying, especially when the senseless thing happened inside something that was supposed to be family. But I want to say clearly, the explaining is not the point. The point is that a child was being harmed in the place he was supposed to be safest by the person he was supposed to be able to trust most completely, and every adult in that child's orbit had a responsibility, a moral, and in many cases, a legal responsibility, to see it and act. The explaining does not change that. The explaining does not give my son back the 8 months he spent learning to sleep lightly and flinch at footsteps and carry things a 9-year-old should not have to carry. What changes things is action. What changes things is refusing to be one of the adults who looked and looked away. I have thought about Carol a great deal in the time since all of this. I have thought about that moment she stood in my kitchen and saw a bruise and made a choice. And I have tried, in the way that men my age are sometimes pressured to be measured and philosophical about things that deserve to be named plainly. I have tried to understand it charitably. Maybe she was afraid. Maybe she did not know how to name what she was seeing. Maybe she believed, in some corner of herself, that it was not her place. None of that is a reason. Being afraid is not a reason. Not knowing the right words is not a reason. There are phone numbers, there are teachers, there are doctors, there are strangers on the internet who will take a concerned call at 2 a.m. from someone who just needs to say out loud, "I think something is wrong with a child I know." Not knowing what to do next is solved in 60 seconds if a person is willing to make a call. Carol was not willing to make a call. She was willing to make my son believe his pain was weakness. That is the part I come back to most, in the quiet. Not what Sandra did, as devastating as that is, but the wall of silence around it. The way cruelty survives, not because it is unstoppable, but because the people who could stop it decide that stopping it is someone else's job. My son is not someone else's job. He is mine. And I failed him for 8 months by trusting a version of normal that was not real. And then I did not fail him again, and that is the thing I am working every day to make peace with. I want to leave you with what Noah said to me one evening, about 4 months after everything had settled down. We were sitting on the back porch after dinner, just the two of us, watching the yard go dark, and he was quiet for a while, the way he gets sometimes, when something is working itself toward the surface. And then he said, "Dad, did you know something was wrong before you put the camera up?" I thought about that carefully before I answered, because I wanted to be honest with him. And I said, "I knew something. I didn't know what. I knew enough to look." He nodded slowly, the way he does when he is processing something. And then he said, "I'm glad you looked." "I'm glad I looked too, buddy. I'm glad I looked." To anyone listening to this who is in the middle of something uncertain, who has a feeling they cannot name, a worry they keep explaining away, a child whose eyes have changed in a way they cannot articulate, please look. Please do not wait until the feeling becomes a certainty, because by the time it becomes a certainty, your child has been carrying it alone for too long already. Trust the feeling. Make the call. Ask the question. Put down the need to be reasonable for one moment, and pick up the need to be present. The warning signs are not always dramatic. They are dark circles, and lost appetite, and flinching at sounds that should not be startling. They are sleeves pulled down in warm weather, and answers that are technically true but feel like walls. They are a child who has learned to take up less space than they used to. Children do not shrink on their own. When a child begins to disappear, something is pressing on them. And it is the job of every adult in that child's life, not just the parents, not just the teachers, not just the professionals, every adult to notice the pressure and ask where it is coming from. I am 62 years old. I spent most of my adult life working hard and doing what I thought a man was supposed to do and assuming the people I loved were safe because I could not see the danger. I know better now, and I am going to spend whatever years I have left making sure my son knows, down to the cellular level, that there is nothing he carries that he has to carry alone. He is the bravest person I know. He was brave in ways no child should ever have to be. And now I am trying to give him a life where bravery looks like the good kind, the kind where you jump off the diving board and you try out for the play, and you show your whole face to the world without bracing for what comes next. That is what we are building, one ordinary day at a time. And ordinary, after everything, is the most beautiful thing I have ever had the privilege of working toward. If any part of this story touched something in you, if you recognize a warning sign, if you have a child in your life who seems different in a way you cannot explain, if you are sitting with a feeling that something is not right, please do not sit with it alone. Reach out to someone. Reach out to a teacher, a counselor, a pediatrician, a crisis line, a trusted friend, anyone. You do not need to have proof to ask for help. You need exactly what you already have. A feeling that something matters. Because it does. That child matters. Your instinct matters. And the difference between doing nothing and doing something, that difference is everything. Thank you for listening.